Now, you talk all the time about software, and you're Mr. Software, but you're also on the board of HP. I know you can't talk about that, but hardware still exists. And Lenovo's here, Michael Dell's here, you're on the board of HP, you've invested in some hardware companies. How does hardware have a role in this going forward? It seems like it does.
Yeah, so I think that the fact that software is becoming so important is actually leading to a new kind of hardware renaissance. I'm actually a little bit radical on this. I think that consumer electronics might be in the process of coming back to the U.S. And that's a pretty big deal for those of us a little bit older, like Andy and myself. 30 years ago, it was when I was growing up, it was a huge topic of like all the consumer electronics businesses were leaving the U.S. because it was all commoditized manufacturing.
Right.
Well, it's interesting. Today, you've got the iPhone, and it's so many it's assembled in China, but all the components are built and designed in the United States. All the profit flows back to the United States. You've got obviously the entire smartphone industry now. All the software is being built in the U.S. You've got, and then you've got all these new categories, and we have two investments we're very happy with. One is Jawbone, and the other is this Lytro, which is our new camera company. Both of which are hardware companies. Designing everything in the U.S. All the profits come into the U.S. And the thing that we think is happening is basically these products are extremely sophisticated software wrapped in very special hardware. But as a consequence, companies that can only do hardware, right, are going to have a very hard time. And so, one of the great stories of our time is what's happening at Sony, right? Because a lot of people remember Sony used to be the innovator in consumer electronics,
right?
And now the new CEO has who's a very talented guy, has a huge challenge on his hands because Sony never became a great software company, right?
Right.
The disconnect between Sony and Apple is largely a story of software, not hardware. So we think that there's this model for basically extraordinary software wrapped in special hardware that is going to be a very big deal. It's going to apply in more and more categories. And then American companies in many sectors are going to be the leading companies because the American companies tend to be better at software.
Mark, I'm curious. You just mentioned you think that the consumer electronics could be coming back to the U.S. You talked about how things are being designed here, still assembled in China. Do you see the assembly potentially coming back? Does it get to the point where for those companies it becomes cost effective to build where you're designing?
Yeah, the assembly. This is the whole thing. This is the whole. To me, this is a lot of the fallacy around China. So manufacturing is a very loaded word, right? As you know, manufacturing implies that something is getting created, but a lot of what happens in China is assembling components that are built elsewhere, or assembling components that, if they're manufactured in China, they're based on American IP. And so the way you actually, in my view, have to look at it from an economic standpoint is gross margin, right? So what is the actual embedded margin in those products? And you basically follow the profits. When we follow the profits, you find that basically the people who actually design the IP, get the majority of the profits, which is kind of how it should be. And so the assembly part is sort of an arbitrage of labor against transport, right? Which is it's cheap enough to ship everything and then ship it back, and then it's cheaper to actually do the manufacturing. I don't know if on the one hand, if these products get more componentized. And they become easier to assemble, then that argues you could bring them back because there's just less work to do during the assembly part. You could also argue that if they get more complex and there's more parts that go into them, you should also bring them back because the manufacturing job gets harder and you might want to have it close to home. You probably want to track the cost of shipping pretty carefully because that has a lot to do with it. But I guess the final thing I'd say is I think it actually doesn't matter that much because as long as everything's this is where I think the China thing's overblown. As long as everything is being designed in the U.S., I don't think it really matters where it's built. I don't think that really has anything to do with the economics. It doesn't have a lot to do with any of the high-value jobs. And frankly, the other problem is there are very few Americans who would actually want to work in a Chinese manufacturing plant, at those wages.